Settle in and let the quiet dark take hold. Tonight we'll explore 8 small terrors, the kind that surface in the hours between sleep and waking. Turn down the light, put on your headphones, and listen to the silence that lingers when the world goes still. These aren't stories meant to shock. They're quiet glimpses into the spaces where unease lives, where fear feels less like panic and more like recognition. In the empty hour, when everything else rests, we notice the things that move just beyond our reach. Story 1. The Last Mile Home. Sarah had driven Route 47 home from her late shift at the diner 1,000 times before. The stretch of 2-lane highway cut through pine forests and farmland, 23 miles of familiar curves and gentle hills that she could navigate in her sleep. On that particular October night, with fog beginning to gather in the low places, she had no reason to think this drive would be any different from all the others. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when she pulled out of the diner's gravel parking lot. Her headlights swept across the empty road as she settled into the rhythm of the drive, windows cracked just enough to let in the cool autumn air. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show discussing topics she wasn't really listening to. It was white noise, a gentle companion for the journey home. Mile marker 15 passed in the darkness, then 14. The fog was thickening now, creeping across the asphalt like something alive, reducing her visibility to perhaps 50 feet ahead. Sarah slowed down, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She'd driven through fog before, countless times, but tonight something felt different about the way it moved, the way it seemed to pulse and breathe around her car. At mile marker 12, she noticed the silence. The radio had gone to static without her realizing it, and when she reached to adjust the dial, she found only more static across every station. Even the AM frequencies, which usually picked up distant signals on clear nights, offered nothing but the soft hiss of empty air. She turned the radio off and drove on, listening to the steady hum of her engine and the whisper of tires on wet pavement. Mile marker 10. The fog was so thick now that her headlights seemed to create a tunnel of pale light that extended only a few car lengths ahead. The familiar landmarks were invisible, swallowed by the gray-white wall that pressed against her windows. She should have reached the old barn by now, the one with the faded mail pouch tobacco advertisement painted on its side. It had been there for decades, a reliable waypoint on her nightly journey home. But the barn wasn't there. Neither was the small bridge that crossed Miller's Creek, or the weathered billboard advertising a roadside attraction that had closed years ago. The road stretched endlessly ahead, straight and featureless. Nothing but fog and darkness, and the hypnotic rhythm of the yellow center line disappearing beneath her car. Sarah's hands began to tremble on the steering wheel. She had been driving for what felt like hours, but the dashboard clock still read 11:47 p.m. The needle hadn't moved. When she tapped the glass face of the clock, it remained frozen at that exact moment, as if time itself had stopped somewhere between the diner and home. Mile marker 8 appeared in her headlights, then faded into the fog behind her. Then, mile marker 8 again, and again. Each time, the same weathered green sign with its reflective white numbers, caught for an instant in her headlights before vanishing into the gray void. She was driving in a loop, trapped on a stretch of highway that shouldn't exist, passing the same mile marker over and over, while the clock remained frozen and the fog pressed closer. She tried her cell phone. No signal. The screen showed full bars, but when she attempted to call 911, the call failed immediately. She tried calling her roommate, her sister, anyone. Each call ended before it could connect, leaving her alone with the sound of her breathing and the endless whisper of tires on asphalt. The last entry in Sarah's journal, found later in her apartment, was dated 3 days before she disappeared. She had written about feeling watched during her late-night drives, about glimpsing movement in her peripheral vision that wasn't there when she turned to look. She mentioned the fog, how it had been appearing more frequently, always on Route 47, always between mile markers 15 and 8. The state police found her car the next morning, parked neatly on the shoulder at mile marker 8, keys still in the ignition, engine running. Her purse was on the passenger seat, her coffee cup still warm in the center console. The driver's door was open, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. They searched the surrounding woods for weeks. Bloodhounds lost her scent at the tree line. Volunteers combed through miles of forest and farmland, finding nothing. The investigation eventually went cold, filed away with all the other mysteries that accumulate in small towns, where the roads run long and straight through empty country. But on foggy nights, other drivers on Route 47 report seeing a woman standing beside mile marker 8, thumb extended, seeking a ride home. They say she looks tired, wearing a diner uniform, and when they slow down to help, she simply fades back into the fog, leaving only the faint scent of coffee and the lingering question of what waits in the last mile home. Moving deeper into the psychological realm, where the familiar sounds of home become something else entirely. Story 2. The Sound Between Silence. David first heard the footsteps on a Tuesday night in March, 3 weeks after moving into the converted warehouse apartment downtown. He had chosen the place specifically for its thick brick walls and concrete floors, seeking the kind of solid quiet that only old buildings can provide. The space was minimal, almost monastic in its simplicity, with high ceilings and windows that faced an empty courtyard where nothing ever moved. The footsteps began at 2:17 a.m., according to the digital clock beside his bed. Soft, measured paces directly above his head, moving from what would be the kitchen area to the living room in a slow, deliberate pattern. David lay still, listening, assuming it was his upstairs neighbor returning home from a late night out. The building had thin walls despite its sturdy construction, and sound carried in unexpected ways through the converted spaces. But as he listened more carefully, something felt wrong about the rhythm. The steps were too regular, too precise, like someone pacing back and forth along an exact path. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Always the same interval. Always the same number of steps before the silence returned. David counted them, 17 steps each way, with a pause of exactly 12 seconds between each sequence. The next morning, he mentioned it casually to the building manager while collecting his mail. She looked at him with confusion, then pulled out a folder of unit layouts. David's apartment, 3B, was the top floor of his section. There was no 4B above him, just the building's flat roof and the mechanical equipment that serviced the heating system. The nearest occupied unit was across the courtyard, too far away for footsteps to carry through the thick masonry walls. That night, David positioned himself in different parts of his apartment, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. At 2:17 a.m. exactly, the footsteps began again. 17 steps from kitchen to living room, 12-second pause. 17 steps back. He moved directly beneath where the sound seemed strongest and pressed his ear against the ceiling. The footsteps were definitely coming from above, but according to the building plans, above was nothing but empty air and roofing materials. He recorded the sounds on his phone, playing them back in the morning light. The audio was clear, unmistakable footsteps against what sounded like hardwood flooring. But David's ceiling was concrete, and the roof above was tar and gravel. There was no wood anywhere in that vertical space, no room for someone to walk, no way for the sounds to exist. Sleep became elusive. Each night at 2:17 a.m., the pacing would begin, and David would lie awake counting steps and measuring pauses with obsessive precision. 17 steps, 12-second pause, 17 steps back. The pattern never varied, not by a single step or a single second. It was mechanical in its consistency, like a recording playing on an endless loop. He began researching the building's history, diving into city records and newspaper archives. The warehouse had been built in 1923, converted to apartments in 1998. No unusual deaths, no tragic accidents, nothing that might explain a restless spirit pacing endlessly overhead. But in the construction records, he found something interesting. The original plans showed a fourth floor that had been removed during renovation, a floor that would have existed directly above his apartment. David started mapping the footsteps, using the sound to create a floor plan of the space above. The 17 steps traced a path from what would have been a kitchen area to a living room, the exact layout of his own apartment but one floor higher. Someone, or something, was walking through rooms that no longer existed, following the memory of walls that had been torn down decades ago. The realization brought no comfort, only a deeper unease. If the footsteps followed the pattern of his apartment, then the invisible walker was living his life in parallel, moving through the same spaces at the same times, separated only by a thin barrier between what was and what had been. On the 31st night, David decided to walk with the footsteps. At 2:17 a.m., as the pacing began above, he started his own journey from kitchen to living room, matching each step, each pause, each turn. For the first time in weeks, the pattern felt natural, almost comforting, like dancing with a partner he couldn't see. But when he stopped at the living room window, looking out at the empty courtyard, he saw his own reflection staring back. And behind his reflection, faint but unmistakable, was the silhouette of someone else. Someone walking the same path in a room that existed only in the space between memory and reality. The footsteps stopped that night and never returned. But David never felt alone in the apartment again, always aware of the presence moving through rooms just beyond perception, forever pacing the boundaries of a home that existed somewhere between the walls. The apartment sounds fade now into highway wind, carrying us toward the open road where other travelers seek rides that may take them far from where they intended to go. Story 3. The Passenger on Highway 9. Highway 9 cuts through the mountains like a scar, winding through forests that grow thick and dark on either side of the narrow asphalt. It's the kind of road that truckers avoid when possible, preferring the wider interstates with their bright rest stops and constant traffic. But sometimes, when weather closes the main routes or schedules run tight, drivers find themselves on this lonely stretch of mountain highway, especially on nights when fog rolls down from the peaks like something alive. The first recorded encounter happened in 1987, though locals insist the passenger has been appearing much longer than that. A long-haul trucker named Morrison was making his way through a particularly thick fog bank when he spotted a figure standing beside the road near mile marker 23. The hitchhiker was a young woman, maybe 25, wearing a simple dress that seemed oddly formal for the mountain cold. She stood perfectly still, thumb extended, looking directly at his approaching headlights. Morrison pulled over, something he rarely did for strangers, but there was something about her stillness that concerned him. She climbed into the cab without a word, settling into the passenger seat with an odd precision, as if she had made this exact movement countless times before. When he asked where she was headed, she spoke only once, her voice barely above a whisper. The next town over. They drove in silence through the fog, the woman staring straight ahead through the windshield. Morrison tried to make conversation, asking about the weather, the lateness of the hour, anything to fill the strange quiet that seemed to emanate from his passenger. She never responded, never moved, barely seemed to breathe. Her presence filled the cab with a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. When they reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, the next town along Highway 9, Morrison glanced over to ask where exactly she wanted to be dropped off. The passenger seat was empty. He pulled over immediately, checking the sleeper berth, looking under the dashboard, even stepping outside to search the roadside. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of flowers and a coldness that lingered in the cab for the rest of his journey. Over the decades, the encounters multiplied. Always the same stretch of highway, always near mile marker 23, always during heavy fog. The details varied slightly from driver to driver, but the core elements remained consistent. A young woman in a dress, thumb extended, asking for a ride to the next town over. She would climb into vehicles with that same precise movement, sit in perfect stillness, and vanish before reaching her destination. In 1993, a family driving home from a wedding picked her up. The father later told police that his children had fallen asleep in the back seat almost immediately after the woman entered their car, despite having been wide awake and restless moments before. His wife sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring ahead with vacant eyes, while the hitchhiker occupied the space behind the driver, so still she might have been carved from stone. A state trooper encountered her in 2001 during a routine patrol on a foggy November night. He stopped to offer assistance, assuming she was stranded. But when she climbed into his patrol car, his radio began emitting a high-pitched whine that grew louder with each mile. The sound was so piercing that he had to remove his earpiece, and when he looked back to check on his passenger, she was gone. The radio returned to normal immediately, but the recording equipment had captured something unusual during those minutes, a frequency that didn't match anything in the known spectrum. Local researchers began documenting the encounters, interviewing drivers who had picked up the mysterious passenger. They found patterns beyond the obvious ones. Every driver reported the same unnatural cold, the same sense of time moving differently during the ride. Several mentioned that their fuel gauges dropped more rapidly than they should have, as if the journey to the next town required more energy than the distance should have demanded. The most disturbing detail emerged from a trucker in 2008, who had installed a dashboard camera after previous encounters with insurance fraud. His footage showed him pulling over, opening the passenger door, and carrying on a conversation with empty air. For 23 minutes, he spoke to no one, nodding and responding to silence, while his fuel gauge dropped steadily, and frost formed on the inside of his windows despite the mild October weather. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from examining old newspaper archives. In 1962, a young woman named Catherine Mills had been killed in a car accident near mile marker 23 on Highway 9. She had been hitchhiking to Cedar Falls, wearing a simple blue dress, when a drunk driver struck her during a heavy fog. Her body was never recovered from the steep ravine where the impact had thrown her. The passenger on Highway 9 continues to appear, thumb extended, seeking a ride to the next town over. Drivers who encounter her describe the same overwhelming urge to stop, the same unnatural cold, the same impossible vanishing. She never reaches her destination, forever trapped in that journey between mile marker 23 and the town she'll never see again. On foggy nights, when visibility drops and the mountain roads become treacherous, local residents know to avoid Highway 9. But sometimes, when the fog is thickest and the need is greatest, drivers still find themselves on that lonely stretch of asphalt, headlights cutting through the gray, searching for the familiar landmarks that will guide them home. And sometimes, just sometimes, they see a figure standing beside the road, perfectly still, waiting for a ride that will never end. From highway to digital static, where impossible images capture things that shouldn't exist. Story 4. The image that shouldn't exist. The phone arrived at the electronics repair shop on a rainy Thursday morning in September, water damaged and completely dead. Marcus had seen hundreds of devices in similar condition, victims of puddles and storms and careless moments near swimming pools. This particular phone, an older model with a cracked screen, had been found in a storm drain after 3 days of heavy rain. The owner never came to claim it. Marcus followed his usual procedure, connecting the device to his recovery equipment and waiting for the familiar boot sequence that would tell him whether any data could be salvaged. Most water-damaged phones were total losses, their memory corrupted beyond repair. But occasionally he could extract photos or contacts for grateful customers who thought they'd lost everything forever. The phone flickered to life after 20 minutes of careful coaxing, its screen displaying the ghostly afterimage of water damage, but functional enough to navigate. The device contained the usual digital detritus of modern life: text messages about mundane appointments, blurry photos of meals and sunsets, a few downloaded songs. Nothing particularly interesting or personal. Marcus was preparing to wipe the device clean when he noticed an anomaly in the photo gallery. One image stood out from the rest, not because of its content, but because of its impossible file properties. The photograph had been taken 3 months in the future, according to the metadata, on a date that hadn't occurred yet. The timestamp showed December 15th, but it was only September 12th. Marcus assumed it was a glitch, a common occurrence with water-damaged electronics, where internal clocks could become scrambled. But when he opened the image, he found himself staring at something that made his hands tremble on the keyboard. The photograph showed the interior of his own repair shop, taken from the exact angle where he was sitting. But the scene was wrong in ways that made his vision blur with confusion. The workbench was there, the familiar clutter of tools and components. but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if the shop had been abandoned for years. In the photograph, his computer screen displayed a news article with a headline he could almost read. Something about a missing electronics repair technician. The date on the article matched the photo's timestamp. December 15th, 3 months in the future. Marcus leaned closer to the damaged phone screen, trying to make out the smaller text. But the water damage made the details impossible to decipher. He checked the photo's location data, hoping for some rational explanation. The GPS coordinates placed the image at his exact address, in his exact shop. But the elevation reading was wrong. According to the metadata, the photo had been taken from a position 12 feet above ground level, floating in the air above his workbench, looking down at the abandoned space below. Marcus saved the image to his computer and examined it with professional photo editing software, searching for signs of digital manipulation. But every analysis confirmed the same impossible details. The image was authentic, unedited, captured by the phone's camera exactly as the metadata indicated. There were no signs of tampering, no digital artifacts that would suggest the photo had been constructed or altered. Over the following days, Marcus became obsessed with the photograph, studying every pixel for clues about its origin. He noticed details that hadn't been visible on the phone's damaged screen. His coffee mug sitting on the workbench, but filled with something dark that wasn't coffee. His appointment calendar on the wall, but the pages were blank, as if all future dates had been erased. Most disturbing of all, there was a shape in the corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows, that might have been a person sitting in his chair. Marcus began documenting everything in his shop, taking daily photographs from different angles, comparing them to the impossible image from the future. Each day brought him closer to the date shown in the metadata, and each day the photograph seemed to gain new details, as if it was becoming more real as its timestamp approached. On December 14th, Marcus stayed late in his shop, waiting and watching, surrounded by cameras and recording equipment. He had convinced himself that understanding the photograph's origin would somehow prevent whatever it depicted from coming to pass. But as midnight approached and December 15th began, he realized his mistake. The photograph hadn't been taken in the future. It had been taken in a present that existed parallel to his own, in a version of reality where time moved differently, where abandoned shops could capture images of themselves and send them backward through the digital void, to warn or taunt those still living in the light. The last entry in Marcus's repair log was dated December 15th, noting the completion of a water damage recovery project. The phone was found on his workbench, fully functional, displaying a single photograph of an empty shop covered in dust. From digital glitch to cosmic void, where distant stars reveal they've been watching us all along. Story 5. The Star That Watches Back. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years studying the night sky from the Palomar Observatory, cataloging distant galaxies and tracking the slow dance of celestial bodies across the cosmic void. She understood the mathematics of space, the predictable orbits and stellar life cycles that govern the universe with clockwork precision. Stars were born, burned, and died according to laws that had remained constant since the beginning of time. Nothing in her scientific training had prepared her for the discovery she would make on a clear October night, when the seeing conditions were perfect, and the sky stretched endlessly above the California mountains. She was conducting a routine survey of the Andromeda constellation, photographing sections of sky through the observatory's massive telescope, when she noticed an anomaly in the star field. A single point of light that didn't match any known catalog, positioned in a region of space that should have been empty according to decades of previous observations. The object appeared to be a star, magnitude 4.2, visible to the naked eye but somehow absent from every astronomical database. Elena checked and rechecked her coordinates, assuming she had made an error in positioning the telescope. But the star was exactly where it appeared to be, occupying a patch of space that had been photographed thousands of times by observatories around the world. She pulled up archival images from the same region, going back 50 years, and found them all identical. Empty space where the star now blazed with steady light. The discovery should have been exciting, the kind of finding that makes careers and fills scientific journals. But something about the star's behavior troubled Elena in ways she couldn't articulate. Unlike other celestial objects, which maintain their positions relative to surrounding stars due to the Earth's rotation, this star seemed to track the telescope's movement, remaining centered in her field of view no matter how she adjusted the instrument's position. She spent the next week observing the anomalous star, documenting its properties with scientific precision. Its spectrum was unlike anything in the astronomical literature, emitting light in frequencies that didn't correspond to any known stellar process. The star showed no parallax shift as the Earth moved in its orbit, suggesting it was either impossibly distant or existing outside normal three-dimensional space. Most disturbing of all, its brightness varied in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, like a slow cosmic heartbeat. Elena began having dreams about the star, vivid nightmares where she found herself floating in space, approaching the mysterious light across vast emptiness. In these dreams, the star grew larger as she drew near, revealing itself to be not a burning ball of gas but something else entirely. Something that watched her approach with an intelligence that predated human civilization by eons. She would wake from these dreams with the sensation of being observed, as if something vast and patient had followed her back from the cosmic void. The star's behavior became increasingly erratic. During her observations, Elena noticed that it would brighten whenever she focused the telescope directly on it, as if responding to her attention. When she looked away or shifted to other targets, the star would dim, waiting with infinite patience for her return. She began to suspect that the act of observation was somehow connected to the star's existence, that her attention was feeding its presence in ways that violated everything she understood about the universe. Other astronomers couldn't see it. Elena shared her coordinates with colleagues at observatories around the world, but their photographs showed only empty space where her star blazed with impossible light. She began to wonder if the star existed only for her, a cosmic message written in light that only her eyes could decipher. The isolation of her discovery filled her with a dread that grew stronger with each passing night. On Halloween night, Elena made her final observation of the anomalous star. As she centered it in the telescope's field of view, she noticed something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The star was moving, not in the slow arc of celestial mechanics, but deliberately, purposefully, growing larger in her eyepiece as if approaching Earth across the vast distances of space. In her final log entry, Elena wrote, "The star is not a star. It is an eye, and it has been watching us since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered what was looking back. Tonight, I understand that some questions should never be asked, and some mysteries are better left unsolved." The observatory found Elena's equipment the next morning, still pointing at coordinates that showed only empty space. Her final photograph revealed nothing but darkness, as if the star had never existed at all. From starlight to candlelight, where melodies carry more than music through the quiet hours. Story 6. The Music Box's Last Song. The antique music box arrived at Margaret's estate sale on a gray morning in November, nestled among dusty jewelry boxes and forgotten trinkets from a life that had ended quietly in a nursing home. It was an unremarkable piece at first glance, crafted from dark walnut with brass hinges that had tarnished to a dull green. The auctioneer barely mentioned it, lumping it together with a collection of other small items that sold for $27 to a young woman who collected vintage curiosities. Sarah Chen had always been drawn to objects with history, things that carried the weight of previous lives in their worn surfaces and careful construction. The music box felt different from the moment she lifted it from the auction table, heavier than its size suggested, as if it contained more than just the simple mechanical components that created its melody. When she wound the small brass key and lifted the lid, a delicate ballerina began to turn, and the box played a tune she didn't recognize, but somehow felt she'd heard before. The melody was haunting in its simplicity, a minor key waltz that seemed to carry echoes of distant ballrooms and forgotten dances. Sarah found herself humming it throughout the day, the tune weaving itself into her thoughts with persistent gentleness. She placed the music box on her bedside table, where its polished wood caught the afternoon light streaming through her bedroom window. That first night, the music box began playing on its own at 3:33 a.m., its melody drifting through Sarah's apartment with crystalline clarity. She woke to the sound, assuming the mechanism had somehow been triggered by settling floorboards or temperature changes. But when she checked the box, the lid was closed, the key unwound, yet the music continued to play from somewhere inside its wooden frame. The tune played for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, then stopped with the same abruptness with which it had begun. Sarah wound the key and opened the lid, comparing the melody to what she had heard in the darkness. It was identical, note for note, but somehow the nighttime version had carried harmonies that the mechanical components couldn't possibly produce. Layers of sound that suggested an entire orchestra hidden within the small wooden box. Over the following weeks, the nocturnal concerts became routine. Every night at 3:33 a.m., the melody would begin, playing its 3 minutes and 17 seconds of impossible music before returning to silence. Sarah began timing the performances, recording them on her phone, but the audio captured only silence, as if the music existed in a frequency her devices couldn't detect. She researched the music box's history, tracing it back through estate sales and antique dealers to its original owner, a woman named Catherine Winters, who had lived alone in a Victorian house on Elm Street for 67 years. Catherine had been a piano teacher, neighbors recalled, known for hosting small recitals in her parlor where local children would perform for their families. The music box had been a gift from her fiancé, who died in France during World War II, and she had kept it on her piano for decades, winding it each evening as part of her nightly routine. But the deeper Sarah dug into Catherine's story, the more disturbing details emerged. 3 of Catherine's piano students had died in accidents over the years, all within weeks of their final lessons. A car accident in 1967, a drowning in 1981, a house fire in 1999. Each child had been practicing the same piece for their upcoming recital, a minor key waltz that no one could identify, a melody that Catherine claimed came to her in dreams. Sarah began to notice changes in herself as the nightly concerts continued. She found herself drawn to minor keys, humming the music box's tune during quiet moments at work. Her sleep became restless, filled with dreams of empty ballrooms where shadowy figures danced to music that played just beyond the edge of hearing. Most disturbing of all, she began to feel watched during the music box's performances, as if something invisible stood beside her bed, listening to the melody with ancient patience. On the 31st night, Sarah decided to open the music box during its 3:33 a.m. performance. As the melody began, she crept toward her bedside table and slowly lifted the wooden lid. Inside, the ballerina turned on her tiny stage, but she was no longer alone. Gathered around her in the music box's small interior were dozens of other figures, translucent and shimmering, all dancing to the impossible waltz that played from somewhere beyond the mechanical world. The music box was found the next morning by Sarah's landlord, who had come to check on her after she failed to appear at work. The box sat open on the bedside table, its ballerina frozen mid-turn, surrounded by empty space that somehow felt crowded with invisible dancers. From melody to silence, where the most terrifying changes happen beneath the skin we trust to contain us. Story 7. The change beneath the skin. Emma first noticed the change on a Tuesday morning in late September, while brushing her teeth in the bathroom mirror of her downtown apartment. It was subtle, barely perceptible, just a slight difference in the texture of her skin along her left temple. The surface appeared smoother than usual, almost polished, as if someone had buffed away the tiny imperfections that normally marked human flesh. She touched the spot with her fingertip, feeling a coolness that seemed to emanate from beneath the surface. At first she dismissed it as a trick of the morning light, or perhaps the result of a new moisturizer she'd been trying. The change was so minor that she might have imagined it entirely, a product of staring too closely at her reflection in the harsh fluorescent glare. But over the following days, the smooth patch began to spread, creeping slowly across her temple, toward her hairline with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The affected skin felt different to the touch, not just smoother but somehow denser, as if the tissue beneath had been compressed or transformed into something that wasn't quite flesh anymore. When Emma pressed against it, there was no give, no soft yielding of normal human skin. Instead, her finger met a surface that felt almost ceramic, warm but unnaturally firm, like touching the shell of some deep-sea creature that had learned to mimic human appearance. She made an appointment with her dermatologist, Dr. Martinez, who examined the area with professional interest, but no apparent concern. The skin showed no signs of irritation or disease, no discoloration or unusual growths. Under the magnifying lens, it appeared perfectly healthy, perhaps even more so than the surrounding tissue. Dr. Martinez suggested it might be a minor reaction to stress or hormonal changes, nothing that couldn't be monitored with regular checkups. But Emma knew something fundamental was wrong. The smooth patch continued its slow expansion, following the contours of her face with deliberate precision. By the end of October, it had reached her left ear, wrapping around the delicate curves with an intimacy that made her skin crawl. She began wearing her hair down, letting it fall across her face to hide the growing area of transformation. The change wasn't just cosmetic. Emma discovered that the affected skin had lost all sensation, becoming completely numb to touch, temperature, and pain. She could press a pin against the smooth surface and feel nothing, as if that part of her body had simply disconnected from her nervous system. More disturbing still, she began to notice that the numbness was spreading internally, creeping along nerve pathways like ice water flowing through her veins. Sleep became elusive as Emma lay awake each night, feeling the slow progression of change beneath her skin. She could sense something moving in the affected areas, not quite pain, but a deep, structural shifting, as if her body was being rebuilt from the inside out. The smooth patches began appearing elsewhere, a spot on her left wrist, another on her collarbone, each one expanding with the same methodical patience. Emma started avoiding mirrors, unable to bear seeing her reflection transform day by day. The smooth skin had a subtle luminescence in certain light, a pearl-like quality that made it appear almost beautiful, if she could forget what it represented. Friends commented on her complexion, noting how healthy and radiant she looked, never suspecting that the glow came from something that was systematically replacing her humanity. By December, nearly half of Emma's face had transformed, the smooth skin creating a perfect demarcation line down the center of her features. She could feel the change accelerating, spreading faster now as if it had gained momentum from its early conquests. The affected areas had begun to pulse with a rhythm that didn't match her heartbeat, something slower and more deliberate, like the breathing of something vast and patient. In her final journal entry, Emma wrote about the dreams that had begun visiting her sleep. She described vast underwater cities where beings moved through liquid darkness, with the same pearl-like skin that was claiming her body. She wrote about understanding, finally, that the change wasn't a disease or transformation, but a calling home to depths she had never known existed. Emma's apartment was found empty 3 days before Christmas, her journal open on the kitchen table beside a glass of water that had never been touched. The only trace of her presence was a small pile of what appeared to be shed skin, smooth and luminescent, arranged carefully on her pillow like a chrysalis that had served its purpose. From internal dread to external mystery, where entire places exist outside the boundaries of normal reality, waiting for travelers who take one wrong turn into forever. Story 8. The Town That Time Forgot. The GPS stopped working somewhere between Cedar Ridge and nowhere, its screen flickering to static before going completely dark. Tom had been driving for 6 hours straight, following a route that should have taken him directly to his sister's wedding in Portland. But the mountain roads had other plans. A rock slide had closed the main highway, forcing him onto a series of increasingly narrow back roads that wound through forests so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. When he crested a hill and saw the town spread out in the valley below, his first reaction was relief. The place looked small but welcoming, with a main street lined with shops and a few church spires rising above modest residential neighborhoods. A wooden sign at the town limits read, Millbrook, population 847, founded 1892, though the paint was so faded it was barely legible. Tom pulled into what appeared to be the town center, parking beside a diner with neon signs advertising coffee and pie. The moment he stepped out of his car, Tom felt something shift in the air around him. A subtle wrongness that made his inner ear ache as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly changed. The town was quiet, not with the peaceful silence of a rural community, but with the oppressive stillness of a place holding its breath. No birds sang in the trees that lined the streets. No insects buzzed in the warm afternoon air. Even the wind seemed to avoid Millbrook, leaving the leaves on the trees perfectly motionless. Tom walked toward the diner, noting the vintage cars parked along the street. Not restored classics, but genuinely old vehicles that looked as if they had been driven straight out of the 1950s, their chrome bumpers gleaming despite the dust that coated everything else in town. Through the diner's windows, he could see people sitting at the counter and in booths, but they sat with an unnatural stillness. Coffee cups raised halfway to their lips, newspapers held at reading angles, all frozen in mid-gesture like actors waiting for a director to call action. The bell above the diner door chimed when Tom pushed it open, a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the small space. The patrons turned to look at him with synchronized precision, their movements so perfectly coordinated they might have been controlled by a single mind. Their faces were pleasant enough, wearing the kind of welcoming smiles that small-town people reserve for travelers. But their eyes held a depth that suggested they had been sitting in those same positions for much longer than the afternoon rush. "Welcome to Millbrook," said the waitress behind the counter, her voice carrying the cadence of someone reciting lines from a play performed thousands of times. "Coffee's fresh, and we've got apple pie that's been cooling since this morning." She gestured toward an empty stool at the counter, and Tom noticed that her hand moved with mechanical precision, as if following invisible tracks in the air. Tom accepted the coffee but declined the pie, trying to make conversation about the road closures and his need for directions to Portland. The waitress nodded and smiled at appropriate intervals, but her responses felt scripted, designed to fill conversational space without conveying actual information. When he asked about the road out of town, she simply repeated that coffee was fresh and pie was cooling, her smile never wavering. Outside the diner, Tom discovered that his car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if some essential component had simply decided to stop functioning. He popped the hood and found everything in perfect working order, yet the vehicle remained as motionless as everything else in Millbrook. Walking back toward the main street, Tom realized that the sun hadn't moved since his arrival. The shadows fell at exactly the same angles. The light maintained the same quality, as if time itself had gotten stuck somewhere between afternoon and evening. The other patrons from the diner had followed him outside, standing in a loose semicircle around his car. They maintained their pleasant expressions, but Tom could see something else in their faces now, a kind of patient hunger that reminded him of predators waiting for prey to exhaust itself running. When he asked again about leaving town, they simply smiled and suggested he might want to stay for dinner, maybe spend the night at the local inn. Tom began walking toward what he hoped was the edge of town, but the streets seemed to fold back on themselves, leading him in circles that always returned him to the main square, where his car sat beside the diner. The sun remained fixed in its afternoon position, casting shadows that never shifted, while the townspeople followed at a respectful distance, their footsteps making no sound on the pavement. As darkness finally began to fall, not from the sun setting but from something else entirely, Tom understood that Millbrook existed in a pocket of reality where normal rules had been suspended. The town was a trap disguised as sanctuary, a place where time moved sideways, and visitors became permanent residents whether they chose to or not. The silence deepens now, drawing us back from these impossible places toward the familiar darkness of our own quiet hour. And so we return to the quiet darkness, where these 8 small terrors first found their voice. The empty hour turns again, offering a kind of refuge to those who drift between waking and dream. If these shadows have kept you company tonight, consider subscribing for more stories from the edges of sleep. Rest well. I'll meet you in the next quiet hour.